What the fuck is up, you beautiful bastards? Back for another deep dive with yours truly. Today we're tackling a real head-scratcher, the Portuguese Empire. You got these dudes from this tiny-ass country on the edge of Europe somehow running around the globe building an empire that lasted for fucking centuries. So crack open a cold one, spark up a fat one, and get ready to unpack how the hell these sneaky motherfuckers pulled it off.
It's a hell of a story, that's for sure. You wouldn't think they'd have the manpower or the resources to build an empire, let alone one that spanned the goddamn globe.
All right, so let's cut the crap and get into it. We got this Wikipedia article that's longer than a CVS receipt, and it's chock full of holy shit moments. First up, these Portuguese assholes go and conquer Ceuta in 1415. So, what the hell was Ceuta? Why did these pricks want it so bad?
Well, Ceuta was the strategic port in North Africa, right on the Mediterranean. It was a major trading hub, with gold, slaves, all that good shit. The Portuguese saw it as a prime piece of real estate, and they wanted a piece of the action. Plus, they were also looking to spread Christianity and kick some Muslim ass as usual.
Typical. Religion and greed, the two greatest motivators in human history.
Yeah,
But conquering a city across the sea, that takes some serious balls.
it does. And this was just the beginning of their expansion beyond the Iberian Peninsula. After conquering Ceuta, they realized they had a knack for this whole empire building thing and decided to keep the party going.
So they conquer Ceuta and get a taste for world domination. What's next on their conquest list?
Well, this is where things get interesting. Enter Prince Henry the Navigator, a dude who was obsessed with sailing and pushing the boundaries of the known world.
Prince Henry the Navigator? Seriously, who the fuck comes up with these names? Was the Navigator, actually part of his legal name?
No, not officially. He wasn't a king, but he was a Portuguese prince with a serious passion for exploration. He poured tons of money into building ships and basically kickstarted the age of discovery for Portugal.
So, what was this guy's deal? Was he just trying to get his name on a bunch of maps, or was there more to it?
He was definitely driven by a thirst for knowledge and a desire to expand Portugal's influence. But there was also a strong economic motive. Remember that spice trade we talked about? The Portuguese were obsessed with finding a direct sea route to Asia, cutting out the middleman and getting their hands on all those delicious spices.
Makes sense. Cut out the middleman, make a shit ton of money, and become the envy of all those other European asshats.
Yeah.
Ambitious bastards. But this was the 15th century, right? No GPS, no Google Maps, just some shitty compasses and a prayer. How the hell do they navigate?
They had this new type of ship called the caravel. It was way more maneuverable than those old clunkers, and it could sail closer to the wind. This allowed them to explore further down the African coast and into uncharted waters.
So they were cruising down the coast of Africa in their caravels, leaving those padrones, those dumbass stone markers with the Portuguese coat of arms like they were playing a cosmic game of Risk. What else were they up to besides planting flags and pissing off the locals?
They were setting up trading posts along the coast. These were basically fortified outposts where they could trade with the locals, mainly for gold and, unfortunately, slaves.
Ah, shit. Here comes the dark side of empire building.
Yeah, the slave trade was a major part of the Portuguese Empire. They basically had a monopoly on the African slave trade for over a century, shipping thousands of slaves across the Atlantic every year.
Fucked up. It's insane to think about the scale of human suffering that went into building these empires.
It's a dark chapter in history, no doubt. But it's important to remember that the Portuguese weren't the only ones involved in the slave trade. It was a global system, and many European powers and even some African kingdoms were complicit in it.
All right, so they conquer Ceuta, then Prince Henry sends his merry band of sailors down the African coast, setting up trading posts and getting involved in the slave trade. But they still haven't reached Asia yet, right? What was the next big breakthrough?
Rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, they finally proved it was possible to sail around Africa and reach the Indian Ocean.
No fucking way. That's like driving across the country blindfolded and hoping for the best. These guys had balls of steel. Who pulled off that stunt?
A badass motherfucker named Bartolomeu Dias. He was sailing for the Portuguese crown, and his voyage opened up a whole new world of possibilities for trade and exploration.
So the Portuguese have finally cracked the code, they've got their route to Asia, and they're ready to start raking in the dough. But hold on, weren't the Spanish also exploring around this time? Didn't they have some beef with Portugal over who got to claim what?
Big time. Remember Columbus? He sailed for Spain and stumbled across the Americas in 1492, thinking he'd reached Asia. This created a massive pissing contest between Spain and Portugal, both eager to claim as much land as possible.
So how did they settle this pissing contest? Did they draw straws, arm wrestle, or just go full-on Game of Thrones on each other's asses.
They went with a slightly more diplomatic approach. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494.
The Treaty of what the fuck ever?
Tordesillas. They basically drew a line down the globe and said everything east of the line belonged to Portugal and everything west belonged to Spain.
Wait, they just divided up the entire world between them? Like a couple of kids splitting a bag of candy?
Pretty much. They didn't even know what was out there yet. But they figured they'd claim it all first and worry about the details later.
Ballsy move. So how did this treaty work out for Portugal? Did they get screwed or did they score big?
They actually got the better end of the deal, at least in the short term. The treaty gave them control of Africa, most of Asia, and a big chunk of what would become Brazil.
Not bad for a country that could barely fit on a map. So, with their new territory secured, the Portuguese were ready to start cashing in, right? Who led that first expedition to India?
Vasco da Gama. In 1497, he set sail from Lisbon, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and landed in Calicut, India in 1498, establishing a sea route from Europe to the east.
Hold the phone. This Vasco da Gama dude just sails across the entire fucking Indian Ocean and waltzes into India like he owns the place. Was he just a ballsy motherfucker? Or did he have some secret weapon up his sleeve?
He was definitely ballsy, but he also had the backing of the Portuguese crown and years of exploration behind him. Plus, he had cannons. Lots of cannons. Nothing says friendly trade mission like a few dozen cannons aimed at your harbor.
Damn straight. So Vasco da Gama lands in India, establishes trade routes, and probably pisses off a few locals along the way. What happens next? Does Portugal just set up shop and start importing spices by the boatload?
It wasn't that simple. They faced resistance from local rulers who weren't too keen on sharing their spice trade with a bunch of European newcomers. But the Portuguese were persistent. They established colonies in Goa and Malacca, and they set up the cartaz system to control trade in the region.
What the hell's a cartaz? Sounds like some kind of ancient Portuguese curse.
It was basically a permit system. Any ship that wanted to trade in the Indian Ocean needed a cartaz issued by the Portuguese. It was their way of regulating trade, collecting taxes, and keeping an eye on their competitors. You could even call it a protection racket on the high seas.
So they were basically running the Indian Ocean like their own personal mafia. Not bad for a bunch of guys from a country smaller than most American states.
Exactly. They played hardball and weren't afraid to use force to get what they wanted. But they also understood the importance of diplomacy and alliances. They played different rulers against each other, often siding with local Hindu kingdoms that were rivals of the Muslim powers that controlled the spice trade.
Smart move. So the Portuguese are the new badasses of the Indian Ocean. They've got trading posts everywhere, they're controlling the flow of spices, and they're probably living it up like rock stars. But what about the rest of their empire? Didn't they also have a foothold in the Americas?
Oh, yeah. Don't forget about Brazil. They stumbled across that massive chunk of land in 1500, thanks to Pedro Alvarez Cabral, who was actually supposed to be sailing to India.
Wait, so they found Brazil by mistake. That's like tripping over a winning lottery ticket on your way to the dumpster.
It's one of those historical what-ifs. But it wouldn't be surprising if they knew about Brazil already and were just waiting for the right time to make their move.
Sneaky bastards.
Yeah.
So now they've got Brazil, they've got Africa, and they've got a big chunk of Asia. What else was on their empire-building checklist? Did they try to conquer China or Japan?
They definitely had their eyes on those prizes. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish direct trade with both China and Japan. They set up a trading post in Macau in 1557 and had a decent presence in Nagasaki for a while. They even tried to take over some territory in China, but that backfired spectacularly.
What happened? Did they run into some bad takeout?
They got their asses handed to them by the Ming Dynasty Navy in a couple of battles. Those Ming Dynasty guys were not to be fucked with.
Damn. So what did the Portuguese do? Did they just pack up their shit and go home?
No, they weren't quitters. They realized that brute force wasn't always the answer, especially when dealing with a superpower like China. So they switched tactics, focusing on diplomacy and trade. They eventually got their trading post in Macau by paying an annual lease to the Chinese authorities. It was a profitable arrangement for both sides.
So by the early 16th century, the Portuguese Empire was a sprawling global powerhouse. They had colonies and trading posts on almost every continent. They were running the spice trade, and they were probably swimming in cash. They were like the original one percenters. But all empires fall eventually, right? What the hell happened to the Portuguese Empire? How did it all go to shit?
There were a lot of factors that led to their decline. One of the big ones was the Iberian Union.
Hold up. The what now? Sounds like some kind of European sausage party.
The Iberian Union. In 1580, the King of Spain also became the King of Portugal. So for about 60 years, the two countries were united under one monarch.
So Portugal basically got absorbed into Spain. Did they have to start wearing those goofy hats and taking siestas?
Not exactly. They kept their own laws and administration, but they were essentially under Spanish control. And this had some serious consequences for their empire.
Like what?
Well, Spain had a lot of enemies, and those enemies saw Portugal's colonies as easy targets. The Dutch, the English, and the French all wanted to expand their own empires, and they started picking off Portuguese possessions in Asia, Africa, and the Americas.
So the Iberian Union turned Portugal into a sitting duck for their rivals. That sucks.
It was a tough time for the Portuguese. They were stretched thin, outnumbered, and outgunned. They managed to hang on to some key colonies like Brazil, but their dominance in the east started to crumble.
And to make matters worse, they had that whole Lisbon earthquake thing in 1755. Talk about bad timing.
That was a total disaster. The earthquake and tsunami killed tens of thousands of people and destroyed most of Lisbon. It was a major setback for Portugal.
So the Portuguese Empire is starting to fall apart. They're losing ground to their European rivals, they're dealing with natural disasters, and their home country is struggling to keep up. What happens next? Did they manage to pull themselves out of this nosedive, or is it a one-way ticket to oblivion?
They didn't go down without a fight. They had a brief resurgence in the 18th century, thanks to the discovery of gold in Brazil, but their golden age was over, and the writing was on the wall. In the 19th century, things really started to unravel. It's pretty wild how those Portuguese fuckers managed to hold on to their empire for so long. What was their secret? Black magic.
Voodoo.
Seriously, right. It's not like they had the biggest army or the strongest economy, especially later on. So how the hell did they do it? Were they just a bunch of sneaky bastards? Or did they have some other tricks up their sleeves? Well, for one thing, they were really good at adapting. They were masters of diplomacy, They knew how to play the game of alliances, even if it meant making deals with some shady motherfuckers. Back then, those European powers were constantly scheming and trying to screw each other over, and the Portuguese were no different. They could be ruthless when they needed to be, but they were also pragmatic.
So like cockroaches, man.
Yeah.
Always finding a way to survive, even when the odds were stacked against them. Tough little bastards.
Exactly. And they were also masters of assimilation. Unlike some of those other European powers, they didn't give a shit about forcing their culture on everyone they conquered. They were all about trade and making money, so they were willing to adapt to local customs to get what they wanted.
So they weren't just a bunch of dicks who came in, guns blazing, and tried to erase everything.
Not always, don't get me wrong. There was plenty of violence, oppression, and forced conversion going on. But there were also a lot of examples of cultures mixing, especially in places like Brazil and Goa, where Portuguese culture blended with indigenous and African influences. They even, banged the locals, learned their languages, and sometimes incorporated some of their religious bullshit into their own.
So they were flexible as hell, willing to compromise, and even bang the locals to get ahead. But they had to draw the line somewhere, right?
Of course. They weren't pushovers. They still had their own core values and beliefs and would defend those when necessary. They were hardcore Catholics and saw their empire as a way to spread Christianity and fight those goddamn Muslims. And, they were also proud as fuck to be Portuguese. They really thought they had a special role to play in the world.
So they were like a bunch of pragmatic motherfuckers with a messiah complex. Like a used car salesman who thinks he's doing God's work.
Haha. That's not a bad analogy. They're definitely a confusing bunch. But I guess that's what makes studying them so damn interesting. They're full of contradictions.
Okay, so let's get back to Brazil. We talked about how they stumbled across it and how it became their most valuable colony. But what was life actually like there under Portuguese rule? Was it all beaches and babes, or was there some shady shit going down?
It was a mixed bag, really. Brazil's a huge and diverse country, so the Portuguese had a hell of a time controlling it. They had to deal with resistance from the indigenous people, that crazy tropical climate and all those damn diseases, and they were constantly having to fight off those rival European powers like the French and the Dutch.
Sounds like a pain in the ass.
Oh, it was. But there were also some big opportunities for wealth and advancement. The discovery of gold in the 18th century, for example, brought a flood of Portuguese settlers to Brazil. And those sugar plantations, which, relied heavily on slave labor, were a major source of income for the Portuguese crown.
So just like in Africa, slavery played a pretty big role in Brazil's development.
Oh, absolutely. Millions of Africans were shipped to Brazil to work on those plantations. It was a brutal system that left a lasting scar on the country.
Fucked up. So you got these gold-hungry settlers, these greedy plantation owners, and these enslaved Africans all trying to survive in this huge, wild country. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It often was. There were tons of uprisings, both by the indigenous people and by enslaved Africans. And there was a lot of tension between different groups of Portuguese settlers who were all competing for land and resources and power.
So not exactly paradise then.
Not for everyone, but for a select few, it was a land of opportunity. And as Brazil grew in wealth and importance, it became pretty clear that it wasn't going to stay a Portuguese colony forever.
Yeah, we talked about how Brazil eventually declared independence back in 1822. But what exactly led to this big breakup? Was it just a matter of time, or were there specific events that kind of triggered it?
Well, there were several factors involved. One of the big ones was the Napoleonic Wars. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil and set up shop in Rio de Janeiro.
Wait, seriously? So these pampered royals traded their castles for some beachside villas?
Basically. And, this move had a huge impact on Brazilian society. It shifted the balance of power, exposed Brazilians to all sorts of new ideas, and kind of planted the seeds for Brazilian nationalism.
So Napoleon accidentally helped create Brazil.
You could say that. His invasion definitely had some unintended consequences that ultimately led to Brazil's independence.
Ironic as fuck. So the Portuguese royals are chilling in Brazil, sipping cocktails on the beach, while their country is getting overrun by Napoleon's army. What happened next? Did they ever go back to Portugal, or did they decide to stay in Brazil and, make it their new kingdom?
They did eventually return to Portugal in 1821 after Napoleon got his ass kicked. But by then, things had changed. Brazilians had gotten a taste of freedom, and they weren't too keen on going back to being a colony.
I bet. So what happened? Did they just tell the Portuguese to go fuck themselves and declare independence?
It was a little more complicated than that, but yeah, essentially. In 1822, Dom Pedro, the son of the Portuguese king, declared Brazil an independent empire and became its first emperor.
Damn, that's cold. So the Portuguese king's own son throws him under the bus and takes his most valuable colony.
Yeah.
Talk about family drama.
Yeah, it was a total betrayal from the Portuguese perspective, but it was also kind of a sign of the times. The age of empires was coming to an end, and this whole idea of national self-determination was spreading like wildfire.
So Brazil breaks away, and the Portuguese Empire loses its crown jewel. But they still had their African colonies, right? What happened to those territories in the 19th and 20th centuries? Did they manage to hang on to them, or did they lose those too?
They did cling to those African colonies for a while longer. But by the mid-20th century, it was pretty clear their days were numbered. The winds of change were blowing across Africa, and those independence movements were popping up everywhere. But those stubborn Portuguese bastards were determined to hold on to their empire, They saw those African colonies as part of Portugal and were willing to fight to keep them.
So they doubled down on their colonial bullshit, even when it was obvious that, the world was moving on.
Exactly. They poured more and more resources into their African colonies, increased their military presence, and basically cracked down on anyone who even hinted at disagreeing with them. They thought they could fight the tide of history, but, they were dead wrong.
So what happened? How did their African empire finally crumble?
It took a long and bloody fight. Those independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, they all launched armed rebellions in the early 1960s, and the Portuguese found themselves stuck in some truly brutal colonial wars.
Were these colonial wars just, minor skirmishes, or were they full-on bloodbaths?
They were far from minor. These wars dragged on for over a decade, cost thousands of lives, and absolutely wrecked the Portuguese economy. They also became super unpopular back in Portugal, where people started questioning the point of empire and, whether it was even ethical anymore.
So they're fighting these losing wars in Africa, their economy's in the shitter, and the people back home are pissed off. What finally breaks them?
The Carnation Revolution.
The what? Sounds like some kind of hippie love-in.
It was the opposite of a love-in. The Carnation Revolution was a military coup in 1974 that finally kicked out that dictatorship that had been in power for decades. It was a bloodless coup, though. They called it the Carnation Revolution because people were, sticking carnations into the barrels of the soldiers' dens.
Poetic, I guess. So the dictatorship falls, and what happens to the empire?
The new government immediately decided to grant independence to all of Portugal's African colonies. They realized the wars were unwinnable, that colonialism was fucked up, and that it was time to, just let go.
So they finally threw in the towel.
Yeah. Pretty much. They held on to Macau for a few more years, but that was just a symbolic handover waiting to happen.
What a wild ride. From global powerhouse to a footnote in history in just a few decades.
It's a classic tale of arrogance, the limits of power, and how things always change eventually.
Deep, man. So the Portuguese Empire is dead and gone, but its legacy lives on, right? We talked about those cultural blends in places like Brazil and Goa.
Yeah.
What else did they leave behind?
Well, for one thing, they left behind a pretty impressive linguistic legacy. Portuguese is spoken by over 250 million people worldwide, making it the 9th most spoken language on the planet. It's the official language of 8 countries, most of which were, former Portuguese colonies.
Wow, so their language actually outlasted their empire. Who would have thought?
It did, and it really shows the lasting power of culture and how empires, even when they crumble, still leave their mark on the world.
True that. But before we wrap up this part, I want to touch on one more thing. We've talked a lot about, their economic motivations, the spice trade, all that gold, the sugar plantations. But there was also this whole religious element to their empire building, right? They thought they were doing God's work by spreading Christianity and fighting Islam. So how did that play out in their colonies?
It's a messy and often fucked up story. The Portuguese were devout Catholics, and they really saw their overseas expansion as a religious mission. So they built churches, sent out missionaries, and often used force to try to convert people to Christianity.
Sounds a bit pushy, even for God's work.
It was, but there were also instances where Christianity kind of blended with local beliefs, creating these new, hybrid religions.
So it wasn't always convert or die.
Not always, but there was definitely a lot of pressure to conform, and there were plenty of cases of, persecution and violence against those who resisted.
Fucked up. Religion can be used to justify some pretty messed up shit.
No doubt, and the Portuguese Empire was no exception.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the rise and fall of the Portuguese Empire, their money-making schemes, their cultural impact, and their religious baggage. So what's the big takeaway from all of this?
Empires are complex and contradictory, man. They're driven by both noble and shitty motives. They leave behind a mixed bag of good and bad. And, ultimately they remind us that power is fleeting and change is inevitable.
Deep shit.
It is, but it's also a fascinating and, I think, a crucial story. All right, let's wrap up this shit show. We've talked about how the Portuguese Empire went from, top dog to bottom feeder. But how did they actually lose those African colonies? Did they just say, fuck it, and hop on a plane back to Lisbon?
Yeah, what the hell happened there? Did those stubborn bastards finally realize their empire was like a sinking ship?
They didn't have much choice. Remember those brutal colonial wars we talked about? Those shit shows dragged on for years, costing Portugal a fortune and making people back home realize that whole empire thing was a fucking disaster.
Yeah, those wars were definitely not for the faint of heart. What was the final nail in the coffin? What made them finally, wave the white flag?
The Carnation Revolution in 1974, it was basically a military coup in Portugal that tossed out the dictatorship that had been clinging to those colonies like a thirsty tick.
A coup? Sounds like some serious shit went down.
It was intense, but it was actually a peaceful coup. The soldiers were putting carnations in their gun barrels instead of bullets, hence the name. The new government was all about peace and democracy, and they realized those colonial wars were a lost cause.
So they basically said, fuck this shit, we're out.
Pretty much. They started negotiating with the independence movements, and within a year, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau were all free.
Damn, that was a quick turnaround. So no more Portuguese Empire in Africa. But what about those little scraps they still had in India? Goa, Daman, and Diu. Did they cling to those like a toddler to a security blanket?
Nope. They actually lost those even before the Carnation Revolution.
Seriously? How did that happen? Did India just roll in and take them?
Basically. India had gotten their independence from Britain back in 1947, and they weren't having any of that European colonialism bullshit on their land anymore. They kept telling Portugal to give those territories back, but, those stubborn pricks refused.
So India said, enough is enough.
Yep. In 1961, India sent in the troops and took those territories by force.
Damn, India don't play around. So Portugal just rolled over and let them take it.
They protested, obviously, but they didn't really have the military muscle to fight back. They'd already lost most of their empire and weren't about to start another war.
So they got their asses handed to them.
Basically. It was a pretty humiliating defeat for Portugal and pretty much the end of their imperial ambitions. They did hold on to Macau for a few more decades, but that was really just a formality, like a long, drawn-out breakup.
So after all those centuries of sailing around the world, conquering shit, and building their empire, the Portuguese Empire ended up as, a bunch of dusty history books and tourist traps.
That's one way to put it.
Damn. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. From those early voyages of exploration to the brutal realities of colonialism and the chaotic mess of decolonization. It's a story full of twists and turns, and it definitely, makes you think.
It does, and it's not just about the past, man. It really helps us understand the world we live in today.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after this deep dive into the Portuguese Empire?
Think about how the legacy of colonialism is still affecting the world today. You see it everywhere, in global wealth and power, in the lingering effects of racism and inequality, and in all those ongoing fights for justice and equality.
Heavy shit, but important shit, right?
Absolutely. By understanding the past, even the fucked up parts, we can try to build a better future.
Word. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into the Portuguese Empire. We've covered their rise, their fall, and everything in between. We've explored the good, the bad, and the ugly. We've talked about their thirst for spices, their love of gold, their religious hang-ups, and how they kind of fucked up the world in more ways than one. But hey, that's history for you. Messy, complicated, and full of lessons we should probably be paying attention to. So stay curious, you beautiful bastards. Stay informed and keep questioning everything. Because the more you know about the past, the better equipped you are to deal with the bullshit of the present. Peace out.